Do you allow AI to think for you? Are machines quietly replacing our minds and the ability to discern and critically think? In a world shaped by artificial intelligence, what does it mean to remain deeply human? If the future is being built in real time, what role are we choosing to play in it? Previously, we explored the systems, policies, and power structures shaping artificial intelligence behind the scenes. From systems to souls, from governments to you. Because beneath the headlines and the hype, there's something quieter unfolding. A generation learning to think less, a world moving faster than its wisdom, and a technology that doesn't just answer questions, but begins to shape the way we ask them. Because AI is not just a tool, it can be a mirror to humanity, reflecting back our biases, blind spots, and our brilliance. And the uncomfortable truth is that the systems we're building often look a lot like us. On this episode of The News in You, I speak with Elle Farrell-Kingsley, a strategic AI advisor recognized as one of the world's leading voices in AI ethics. She's advised governments, parliaments, and global institutions on responsible technology and the future of digital power. I'm Eleisha Foon, journalist, storyteller, and I believe everyone you walk past has a story, and that story could change your life. So let's crack it open and discover the news in you. Let's dive into part 2 of my conversation with Elle Farrell-Kingsley. We, I guess at the moment, are seeing real tensions between governments and tech companies. And I've seen a number of interviews with the founder of ChatGPT or OpenAI, Sam Altman, saying some very fatalistic things. His comments about, yes, AI is going to be the end of humanity. But in the meantime,
A kid born today will never be smarter than AI.
I expect some really bad stuff to happen because of the technology.
And anybody will be able to make a video of you doing whatever they want with video that's publicly available of you on the internet.
There'll be extremely capable biomodels available open source that could help people create new pathogens.
I cannot imagine having gone through the, figuring out how to raise a newborn without ChatGPT.
Why should we trust you?
You shouldn't.
Well, we haven't put a sexbot avatar in ChatGPT yet.
Ads plus AI is sort of uniquely unsettling to me.
The board can fire me. I think that's important.
If I were 22 right now and graduating college, I would feel like the luckiest kid in all of history.
We don't yet know how to think about some superintelligence being aligned with dictators and totalitarian countries. We don't know how to think about countries using AI to fight new kinds of war with each other.
People talk about how much energy it takes to train an AI model relative to how much it costs a human to do one inference query. But it also takes a lot of energy to train a human. It takes like 20 years of life and all of the food you eat during that time before you get smart.
I think AI will probably, most likely sort of lead to the end of the world. But in the meantime, there will be great companies created.
Is that concerning to you?
I think it's always challenging to try and discern what's marketing hype. But I think it raises the very important question of, okay, if you think this technology is going to cause the end of humanity, why are you continuing to develop it? Why are you putting us on this path? And I think if you were to confront that answer, you would either kind of have two options. Either, okay, that is the path believed to happen from these developments and you kind of have to face that, or you take a step back and realize it's probably overhyped just a little. But I do also believe that some of these expressions are kind of diverting away from the real concerns. So I know we've mentioned some of them already, but I think also, especially if we use the example of ChatGPT, the water usage and the kind of climate concerns associated with these technologies, and especially as we're seeing these raw materials and finite resources kind of have these geopolitical concerns, I think people are very much overlooking those concerns to think about, quote, the end of humanity.
Do you think AI is threatening what is uniquely human? We're starting to see Gen Alpha heavily rely on social media and AI, and there have been a number of studies and research and commentary about how each generation has had more information and therefore more intelligent, but Gen Alpha is the first generation that doesn't follow that trend because of its over-reliance, or the over-reliance on AI and social media.
100%. I think this is such a big concern of mine, and I think specifically in the examples, but we've seen this decrease in the IQ tests as well for the younger generations. But I think a huge part of that is also the decrease in literacy. Very few people in younger generations, well, they're reading much less. And I think there's also not just on their behavior, but I think the surrounding environments in which they are in. So if we consider governments all around the world are now cutting or not supporting degrees that they consider meaningless. In the UK, they call them Mickey Mouse degrees. I know in the US, they're not supporting a whole bunch of degrees that were previously considered professional. And I think in China, we're also seeing a very much emphasis on STEM careers. And I think what that's leading to, so when you have an attack on the humanities and the arts and philosophy, therefore that then decreases critical thinking and the ability just to question narratives. I think that's especially important, myself included. So I have a liberal arts background, and many people within AI policy and even journalism have arts backgrounds. And so if we're seeing a decrease in those subjects being supported, then it's no wonder that Gen Alpha and below are going to be lacking those skills. And I think it's so easy. I hear it. It's my dreaded expression when I hear now, instead of Google it, it's we'll just chat GPT it for really simple things that I think don't even require you to search. I think if you just have a think about it. And then this is something I've also seen in classrooms when I teach at universities. You can ask a very simple question, such as, what do you think about this? And they will still quickly check AI to get the perfect answer. And so I think that also requires older generations to be more supportive, and instead of criticizing them, saying you don't think, actually kind of taking a step back and saying, that's okay, we don't need that here. I would be really interested to hear what you have to say about this. And I have noticed with support, they are kind of more proactive to using their brains.
Sounds like we need to teach the generation that is facing the most harm by empowering them to be able to think and teach them how to think critically.
Yeah, I would 100% support that. I just think, how can you expect them to have these critical thinking skills when there's an active attack on the arts and critical thinking skills? And so that's a lot of the work I do with my workshops, is really encouraging them to kind of question what's going on, perhaps who benefits from this, and engaging with those readings. I think now we're so used to like these summaries of everything, whereas I've seen even on YouTube, there's now summaries of the YouTube video, academic articles, there's summaries. And so kind of asking, what's the rush? Let's slow down and make our own summary.
What are some of the tips, or what is the encouragement that you give your students, or even when you are consulting and advising organizations and government around teaching critical thinking and taking that approach of slowing down?
Yes, I think interesting. I do a combination. So I also often do it through the lens of technology, AI, and privacy. And I always think one of the most important things you can do is just start from step one. I think so many people are perhaps worried to get something perfect the first time or come in at a high level because they think that's where they should be. They should be expert level. But let's just start from step one and slowly add the pieces. And for example, we just begin to ask, okay, what's the main arguments towards this? What would the writer or whoever created this thing, why would they create this? What do they benefit from this? What are the counter arguments? Is there a middle ground? And yeah, just kind of build it kind of brick by brick and hopefully kind of discern your own opinion from that. You don't need to share the same idea that everybody thinks. I think that's even more important in the current kind of technology system, because online and digital spaces, we are just surrounded in these echo chambers where many people say the same ideas and the same thoughts. And I very much encourage having just a variety of perspectives. And I think one skill that has been lost is the ability to have just a friendly debate that isn't a huge argument or completely tied to your personal beliefs as identity.
I couldn't agree more. It's something that I really encourage and am moving the News and News series to be able to do that. Two truths can exist at once. And how do we have differing opinions at the table, but to find common ground and to respectfully agree to disagree? Because I think we're starting to see identity politics and even religion and religion politicized in such a way that people again have attached their personal belief systems to that identity and policy, and it can get really divisive, and we're seeing that, and we're seeing the way that the world is right now, and it is pretty disturbing. So yeah, there's a lot that we have to do. There's a lot that I think is on our shoulders as the generation being able to see all of these issues. How do we solve it all? I'm not sure, but we're trying our best, aren't we?
I think one thing we could do as well is just going into these conversations without a set outcome, not going in thinking, I'm going to win mentality. I think a huge difference, and this is something I feel liberal arts and philosophy does teach, which is the idea that you should be able to go in and fully prepare to have your perspective changed. In fact, that's one of my favorite feelings. I love going in. I think I have my idea on how this thing works, and somebody raises a really interesting counterpoint. I'm like, oh, I hadn't considered it that way. Great idea. Thank you. I will now include that in how I see the world. And I think that is an art and a skill that has been lost, but something I heavily encourage people to go out and practice, maybe your friends, your family, and just have these light-hearted conversations. Doesn't have to be about identity politics. It can be about favorite colors or food and kind of go from there.
I love that. You mentioned that when it came to developing some of the AI models, that the data that was fed would be quite telling about people. And you've also mentioned about the need for diverse voices and diverse perspectives to be a part of those conversations. Can a system trained on global data truly represent diverse cultures? And how do we make sure that marginalized communities aren't left out of the conversation in the way AI is shaped?
Generally, as a whole, these systems are not inherently representative of a whole of society. Like step one, I think the statistics of men to women working in these industries are hugely skewed. I think that each year there is an increase of women working in AI, but still it's not an equal representative compared to the population. Then I think another concern is the idea that these AI systems are primarily in English, and that's not representative of the world and of populations. And so unfortunately, many will be excluded from this. And another overlooked aspect is the access to this technology and even access to the internet. So there are millions of people across the world who don't have access to the internet, and therefore they are excluded from these developments. Unfortunately, it can't be representative in its current stage, and a great example of that would be even like the Compass algorithm in America, where they're using facial recognition to predetermine legal outcomes, and they're using it in criminal cases, kind of giving predictions on who's likely to reoffend and what verdicts they should be given. And what we're very much seeing in these outcomes is the use of racial profiling, and certain communities have advantages from this and certain communities have disadvantages. Although I guess another interesting argument is, if it's trained on human data, is that reflective of our own inherent biases? And so that's also an area we need to consider.
That point right there is something that I've been extremely fascinated by, and what I've been grappling with some of these AI experts is AI just a mirror, reflecting our own internal value systems, philosophies, beliefs, and our own internal biases? And my view on that is yes, because often when I've kind of experimented with different AI models, it has reflected and sounded like me. I guess I'm training to create like a mini me through, robotic or AI version or system. And yes, there's a whole lot of other data reflected in that, but you can very much say, no, don't think this way, or, And I wonder what your view is on that. How do we make sure that we're not just creating a system that is very much like the one that we see within humanity? Because we've seen colonization, the way that some communities have been completely left out. We see racism is still an issue, even within our justice systems. There's still a lot of inequality for men and women around the world in so many different areas. Are we just recreating this through the internet?
So I think one interesting test that everybody can do at home is, if you go into an AI and say, write me a story or with a character, and look at what name it gives you, or is it a man or is it a woman? How do they describe it? And what many test results are seeing is that often it tends to be a very westernized name because the people developing and the training data is in English. Very often, even when I have used AI, it tends to assume I'm a man. And I think that's something very common that people see. Many people think that AI has surpassed this stage already. They think that they've personalized it. But I think it can be very easy in unsuspecting ways to see how many biases it inherently carries. And we're also seeing, if it knows a little bit of data about you, how it completely has different approaches. But I would say AI and these chatbots in their current form do not possess their own form of intelligence. They are generating, not creating. And so really it's just all in the data set. And I think, like you say, it's a very interesting point on what data has it been trained on. And I think it's like the gun argument, I would say. Is the gun a weapon, or is the person wielding it going to use it for harm? And I think the data sets, each model has different data sets and is always learning, always training. I think if we look at Google's, even the idea that they're going into people's emails and Google Docs, I think to correct this would require very conscious effort, acknowledgement from the tech companies that these problems and biases exist, which I don't think has happened wide scale. To then admit that they exist would then also require kind of people mindfully to come in and edit those processes, edit the data sets. And so that is slightly in one of my roles. I did work on, quote, humanizing the data models. So I would look at the responses and then edit it to try and make this more inclusive, less stereotyped. But not all models are using this.
Well, it's good to know. It's comforting to know that there are some people that are trying to provide solutions to stop that from evolving the way that it could. But again, how do you make sure that there is that consistency? I guess, do you have a message or advice for researchers, for people that are shaping this industry and these models?
I think one of the most important things you can do, as we've kind of touched upon, is taking or bringing your own personal experiences, your personal background, your philosophies, your culture, anything you have to share. And if you're working on that model, kind of contributing it so it is more reflective of a whole of society. And I think under the kind of current guidelines, I think many people are afraid to do that. They kind of have a very sanitized version of what they think should be on those models. But then secondly, ensuring it's difficult, I feel, because big tech will have certain processes, and I think the intention behind why are you working on AI is something that also needs to be considered. So there will be some people who just want to kind of climb the career ladder, make as much money as possible, maybe create their own AI. And so if they're very profit driven, I think that will lead to very different outcomes compared to perhaps the researchers. Perhaps they take a lower salary, but they're working with different intentions. But one thing I would say overall, I went to Tsinghua University to attend a roundtable on how can countries come together globally to work on AI and develop policy that's not competitive. And I think keeping an open mind for global perspectives, and instead of seeing each other as competition, seeing each other as collaboration, is one way I think we will see, hopefully, more community-led AI with more advantages for humanity.
Wouldn't that be wonderful? Goodness, I've heard a lot of stories bubbling away around the way some people have been treated in Silicon Valley who may have different perspectives and outcomes, and it's scary and it's sinister. And I'm wondering if you have any insights to what is going on behind the scenes for when researchers or developers of AI put their foot down and are uncomfortable with perhaps motives that look similar to greed and profit and not protecting, I guess, the good of humanity when it comes to pushing this technology forward.
Yes, I think it's certainly quite a scary underbelly of the industry. I won't sugarcoat that. I think especially some of the allegations that have come out are, as you say, very sinister. Ideally, I think it would be positive to see people come together, because if it's just one or two people who kind of express their concerns, then they're individual whistleblowers, or they're overly concerned, or perhaps they were never reliable, or they have a vendetta. But if entire teams come together, then it's more of a worried concern. However, I think one of the really challenging aspects of the industry, especially if you think of Silicon Valley, are the salaries. And so because the salaries are so large, it does inherently attract those who perhaps might be willing to overlook some of the concerns. And I think it's even more challenging in this current economy and climate. People are concerned about how they're going to live, how they're going to pay rent or mortgage, the living costs. And so when you have people so worried about survival, how can if they want to speak out about what's happening, perhaps they don't feel able to. Perhaps they have the concern of their family going on at home. So yeah, I think I've probably raised more problems than answered from that question. But okay. I think it's something to consider. And for me, that is why I personally prefer to be more of an independent contractor and go where I feel my values are followed.
The conversation around values feels more important now than ever. Our philosophies, our ethics, our moral compass, and the purity of motives when it comes to AI and developing technologies, or even just being a part of the conversation, just feels really, really crucial right now. For people wondering at home, how can I be a part of this? Perhaps the roundtable conversation, if they're not working in the space of AI, but they may have the ability to train AI or even just use it in their everyday life. How do we make sure that we're contributing for good and don't necessarily just give up and feel powerless? Because I want to make sure people feel they have hope at the end of this conversation.
Well, I think it can be very easy to focus on the negatives, and sometimes I feel they almost need to be mentioned as an equalizer, because AI can be very much portrayed as this hero that's going to save everything for humanity. However, there are many positives as well that can also be overlooked. And I think for what can you do personally in your day-to-day, I think small things such as if you do have concerns, you can flag them. I think lots of developers actually have a section. And I would say in most development teams, there are people who care about the betterment of the product. Of course, I focused on some of the negatives, but there are people who care on the team. And so that can usually help. But one thing I think is also very much overlooked, which is if you are feeling there's a concern in how AI is used or how it's being developed, you can very much reach out to your local politician. And so if enough people in your area, maybe you ask your friends or your family, and the politician will then hopefully bring them up on your behalf within their local area. And this is something that happened when I ran these national dialogue, and having those conversations then led to real conversation in UK Parliament. And this was especially on AI's impact on young people. So things like education, job security, what can be done. There's now actually another conversation that's happening on the 17th of March in Parliament in the UK about these conversations. And then I think even smaller, taking one step back, is having those conversations. So again, I guess going to what we've already discussed, using that critical thinking, having the conversations with your friends and family, and having that expression of what do we think is going on with AI, what can we do, feeling empowered, maybe having your perspective changed. Perhaps instead of sharing an article that's like a doomsday article, maybe you could even go in and say, okay, what do we think the intention behind the article is? What do they benefit from that? What do you think about these uses? And I think the more that communities and the everyday person have conversations about these developments, then the less scary and the less unknown and mysterious it becomes.
I love that. That's great advice. Thank you. As someone who calls himself a futurist, how would you picture the future with AI in the next 5 to 10 years, if you could forecast the future? Paint that picture for us.
Okay, so typically in my futures work, I go a little further ahead, maybe 50 years to 100 years. And for 5 to 10 years, I think one thing is often overlooked because everybody is just talking about AI all the time. Recent studies show that actually quite a small amount of the population regularly use AI. It just seems that we're talking about it so much more. And so I think there will be greater upuse and use of AI in everyday uses. I would like to think, based on current developments, that policy will have met some new regulations. But I also suspect that AI as we know it will slow down in its innovation, where currently it feels like if you haven't seen the latest update in the last 2 weeks, you're out of date. I think we'll slow down and we'll have more regulation, but I think we will see AI transform away from the primary use of chatbots and perhaps more into regular uses. So seeing it more like quantum computing is being used for calculations, but perhaps even just in everyday technologies, perhaps. I know China currently has AI integrated into a lot of systems. So even like when you arrive or you do visa applications, there's a lot of AI being used for translation, like instantly. And so I think just general everyday convenience that right now would be like, oh, I can't imagine that. But perhaps in 5 or 10 years, it's just an integrated way of life.
Right. Okay. And then you have me curious with the 100 years from now. Let's go futurist and bold. What does that look like, do you think?
Yeah, so to use future foresight, kind of imagine a faraway perspective, and then to get there, you kind of take a few steps back using this 3-horizon scanning method and go, okay, what do we need to do to reach that future? And so one thing I think is a fun exercise for everybody to do is perhaps 100 years in the future you would like to see, and then perhaps the future you don't want to see. And then you find the middle ground of, okay, what elements might we see of both? But the future I would like to see in 100 years would be increased literacy, not decreased, not an over-reliance on AI or technologies. Ideally, I guess we would have moved past the use of AI used in warfare. It's obviously a very current concern. And hopefully just an improved flow of life. I think if we look at popular fiction and like ideas such as Neuromancer by William Gibson or Cyberpunk 2077, I think it's a very slippery slope between innovation kind of sliding into a dystopian reality. So I would love to think the current conversations, so in the UK and Finland, across the world, parliaments are now kind of gearing up to have a parliament or committee of the future. And so these parliaments are now having consideration of how do we get the next 50 to 100 years right? Because many people won't be alive, and it's having that consideration of future generations. So I feel like a little bit of everything there, I think. Hopefully an improved convenience for life. Perhaps we'll eventually have our flying cars that we've been waiting for, but certainly an improvement to now, I would hope. But equally, it could go horrifically too.
Does the responsibility lie with the United Nations or a different board entirely to make sure that collaboratively we are working for the good of humanity and not leading to a destructive future that a lot of people are fearing?
Well, I think currently the UN does have a board of AI with experts across the world. I went to the UN in Geneva in 2019. I remember sitting in with the Human Rights Council, and there was this real discussion on should countries that have been accused of breaking human rights, should they be included in human rights councils or discussions? And this idea of even if they are breaking it, it's much better that they are exposed to the criticism from everybody else on the council and the suggestions. And actually, I think a very similar stance can be taken for AI. So perhaps even if they are not being developed in the way that a wider society would prefer, it's much better that they're in the conversation, hearing what other people think they should be doing to lead to that improvement. And I do think that's one advantage of organizations like the UN, which is the fact that so many different countries and their citizens or their experts can come together. And it is typically much more of a balance compared to, for example, I know there are like NATO tech leading institutions and boards, and that then has a very limited demographic on their focus. So I think two things, really. I think one of them is just a caution, or it's important to remember that when it comes to AI, I think a lot of people use the word create. Like, does it create jobs, create art? And just having that memory for everybody that it generates, it regurgitates, it takes pre-existing text or art and kind of shows you a version that will be similar. And I think having that mindset can really help people feel less almost like it's an all-powerful entity. And remember, it's just a piece of technology that's doing as it's being processed to do at the moment. And then I think one other aspect is also the funding towards AI. So I think when people are considering countries and competition, I think one very helpful way to get an idea on what's actually being done and who is leading is, for example, at Stanford's AI Index, and looking at how much money each country is really putting into its AI.
Thank you for that. That's so helpful. I have loved every moment of this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. And
I can't wait for people to listen to this, and I'm sure there's a lot to take away because I've taken a lot myself.
Thank you for having me.
This is not just a conversation about AI. It's a conversation about values, about the kind of world we're building, and whether we're brave enough to take responsibility for it. Because the truth is, most people will never sit in a government roundtable on AI, but every single one of us is already shaping it through what we share, what we question, what we choose to believe, and what we're willing to challenge. So maybe the power isn't as far away as it feels. Maybe it starts smaller with us, with conversations at the dinner table, with asking better questions, with choosing not to outsource every thought, with remembering that intelligence is not just about having answers, it's about knowing how to think. And maybe, just maybe, that's the part of humanity we cannot afford to lose. Because the future of AI is still being written. And whether we realize it or not, so are we.
Thank you for listening to The News and You. Your support means the world. If you believe in the work we do at The News and You, sign up to our Patreon. It really is the best way to keep this going and be part of our Newsies community. I'd be so grateful if you can share the love by leaving a rating and review. It'll help spread these stories even further. What are your key takeaways? If the story impacted you or even made you see the world a little differently, why not share it with your friends and family? Until next time, remember, your story matters, and there's a shared truth behind everything.